Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. When alien students learned what was Earth like before the dinosaurs, the Intergalactic Academy of Historical Sciences prided itself on being the most prestigious institution in 7 galaxies, which wasn't saying much considering 5 of those galaxies were mostly uninhabitable gas clouds with exceptionally good PR departments. Still, it had a reputation to maintain, which is why Professor Zxylorn was currently experiencing what humans might call an aneurysm. You're telling me, the professor said, each of his 7 e-stalks twitching independently in what xenobiologists recognize as extreme academic distress, that not a single one of you completed the pre-reading on Earth's Precambrian era. The lecture hall, designed to accommodate 37 distinct species in their various anatomical needs, remained silent except for the occasional squelch of a morphine student accidentally secreting anxiety fluid onto the antimatter upholstery. The professor's exoskeleton clicked in irritation. Well, does anyone have anything to say for themselves? A tentative appendage rose from the back row. It belonged to Glix, a gelatinous collective consciousness who had the unfortunate habit of splitting into smaller versions of itself. When nervous, with all due respect, Professor Glix burbled, already beginning to separate into 3 smaller glies. Earth history before the dinosaurs as well. It's just rocks and bacteria, isn't it? We skipped ahead to the good parts with the giant lizards and the mammals with their hilarious nuclear weapons. The professor's central eye stalk drooped in despair. This was exactly the problem with teaching xenohistory to the current generation. Everyone wanted the flashy stuff, the extinctions, the wars, the reality television. Nobody appreciated the subtle beauty of single-celled organisms spending 2 billion years just figuring out how to split properly. You know what the professor said, his voice modulator shifting to what his students recognized as the dangerous. I'm about to assign a project frequency. I think you all need a more immersive experience. Cancel your plans for the weekend. We're going on a field trip. A collective groan rippled through the assembled students, with various species expressing dismay through their preferred biological mechanisms: deflation, color changing, spontaneous molting, and the case of the Cronwares briefly aging backward. But Professor protested. Chris 7, a cybernetically enhanced avian whose ancestors had evolved from what Earthlings would recognize as something between a pterodactyl and a USB drive. The galactic gravitational ball is this weekend. It only happens once every 87 cycles. Should have thought about that before you decided. The foundation of all complex life on one of the galaxy's most ridiculous yet somehow influential planets wasn't worth your attention, the professor replied, not unsympathetically. He remembered being young once, about 300 million years ago. Besides, you might actually enjoy it. Earth's early periods were surprising. Little did the students know that surprising was Professor Zxylorn's favorite understatement. The last time he described something as mildly interesting, it had been the spontaneous conversion of a gas giant into a sentient cheese. The time before that, it had been the birth of a black hole with a peculiar tendency to hiccup out Shakespeare quotes in semaphore. This was going to be so much worse. The Academy's temporal observation vessel affectionately nicknamed the past its prime hum to life. As the reluctant students filed aboard, designed to observe but never interact with historical events, it existed partially outside normal spacetime, allowing its occupants to witness history without AC accidentally stepping on any metaphorical butterflies or literal ancient ancestors. Everyone strapped in, the professor asked, his appendages dancing across the ship's crystalline control panel. Temporal observation can be a bit disorienting for first-timers. The ship's eye, which had the personality of an overworked tour guide who had seen too much of history to be impressed by anything anymore, chimed in. Please secure all temporal anchors and existential tether. Student with non-linear perception of time are advised to take the recommended medication. Those with fewer than 3 dimensions are reminded to wear their spatial supplements. The management is not responsible for any paradoxes, causality violations, or sudden revelations about the futility of existence. Before anyone could protest further, Professor Zxylorn activated the temporal drive and the ship shuddered, reality blurring around them like paint. In a cosmic washing machine. First stop, the professor announced cheerfully as the blur solidified into a view of absolute nothingness, approximately 4.6 billion years ago, the formation of Earth's solar system. The students pressed their various sensory organs against the observation windows, or in the case of the telepathic species, pressed their minds against the concept of windows. "I don't see anything," complained Rex, a silicon-based life form whose ancestry included both rocks and accountants, somehow combining the most unyielding qualities of both. "Just wait," the professor said with the satisfaction of someone who knew exactly how good the show was about to get. As if on cue, the nothingness erupted. A massive cloud of dust and gas began to swirl, collapse, condense at its center. Nuclear fusion ignited the birth of a star around it. Matter clumped together, forming protoplanets, that the professor said, pointing to a particular swirling mass of rock and gas. "Will be Earth, it looks chaotic," observed one of the smaller glies, who had now split into 7 distinct puddles of consciousness. "Oh, you have no idea," the professor chuckled. "Computer, advance us about 100 million years, please." The scene shifted, and suddenly they were looking at a hellscape. The proto-Earth was a molten ball of fire and rock being bombarded constantly by asteroids and smaller planetary bodies. "Welcome to what Earth scientists eventually called the Hayden Eon," the professor announced, named after their mythological underworld. "Quite appropriately, the Earth is currently being pummeled by leftover debris from the solar system's formation. Temperature on the surface about 3,600 degrees. Atmosphere toxic soup of hydrogen, methane, water vapor, and ammonia. Oceans made of actual magma." The students stared in horrified fascination. "And the best part," the professor continued, "all 7 eye stalks now fully extended in excitement. In about 5 seconds on cue, 8 meme-sized planetary body slammed into Earth at an oblique angle. The impact was catastrophic, sending a significant portion of Earth's mantle and the impact's material into orbit," the professor said with undisguise. "Is what Earth scientists call Theia. That collision just created Earth's moon also. It basically melted everything all over again. Isn't it beautiful?" The students were silent, transfixed by the violence of the spectacle. "But how did anything ever live there?" asked Krill 7, who was rapidly recalculating his life choices and considering a major in something less traumatic like quantum accounting. "Patience," the professor said. "Computer, advance us about 700 million years, please." The scene shifted again. Earth was still hot, still largely inhospitable, but it had developed a solid crust. Massive volcanic eruptions spewed gases into the atmosphere. Asteroid impacts, though less frequent, still pockmarked the surface regularly. "Now we're in the era neon," the professor explained. "Earth has cooled enough to form a solid crust, but still no oxygen in the atmosphere. Instead, it's mostly nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and water vapor. Surface temperatures around 200 degrees. Still no place you'd want to vacation unless you're a pyrovore." The lone pyrovore student in the class perked up briefly before slumping back down when the professor added, "Although even you would find the ambient radiation a bit excessive." "But where's the life?" asked Rex, who was beginning to wonder if this whole field trip was just an elaborate punishment. "Aha, now we're getting to the good part." Computer, zoom in on that shallow sea region, please." The view focused on what appeared to be a primordial ocean. At first, nothing seemed special about it. "Look closer," the professor urged, and there they were, microscopic structures, primitive cells floating in the ancient waters. "Behold," the professor announced with a reverence usually reserved for religious experiences or particularly good desserts. "The first life on Earth, simple prokaryotic cells, ancestors to bacteria. They're feeding on chemicals from hydrothermal vents and using chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. They have no nucleus, no organelle, just a cell membrane, some ribosomes, and DNA floating freely inside." And yet the professor's voice took on a tone that made even the most bored students pay attention. "These simple cells will eventually give rise to everything on Earth: the dinosaurs, the mammals, the humans, the trees, the fauna Everything. This is where it all began, in boiling toxic oceans under a sky that would kill most of you in seconds. A strange silence fell over the observation deck as the students contemplated these humble beginnings. So the professor said, after a moment's still think, the Precambrian is boring. Compute compter, Professor Zxylorn commanded. Advance us to approximately 3 billion years ago. The scene shifted again. Earth now looked marginally less hostile, though still nothing like the blue-green world humans would eventually photograph from space. Now pay attention, the professor said, because what's about to happen will change everything. On the observation screen, they watched as primitive cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, began to conduct what would lack to be known as oxygenic photosynthesis. These little overachievers, the professor explained, gesturing to the microscopic organisms, are about to commit what some might call the first and greatest act of global terrorism. They're going to fill the atmosphere with oxygen. Isn't oxygen good? Asked one of the Glix puddles who had recently been studying Earth's modern atmosphere. Not if you're an anaerobic organism that evolved in an oxygen-free environment, the professor replied. Imagine if someone suddenly filled this room with chlorine gas. That's essentially what these cob bacteria are doing to their fellow microbes. They're producing oxygen as a waste product of photosynthesis, and that oxygen is basically poisoned to most life. Currently on Earth, the students watched mesmerized as the professor had the computer accelerate time, showing the gradual increase of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere over hundreds of millions of years. This event, the professor said solemnly, will later be called the Great Oxygenation Event, or more dramatically, the oxygen catastrophe. It's the first mass extinction in Earth's history, and it's caused by pollution, oxygen pollution. So the first life on Earth poisoned the planet and caused a mass extinction, clarified VX, who was finding a new appreciation for the brutal efficiency of evolution. Exactly, the professor confirmed. And here the ironic part, that poison eventually became essential for most complex life on Earth. The organisms that survived either had to hide from oxygen in anaerobic environments or adapt to use it. Those that adapted found that oxygen was actually incredibly efficient for energy production. It paved the way for more complex life forms, so they turned a catastrophe into an opportunity. Used krill 7 life on Earth did that a lot, the professor noted. It's one of the planet's most consistent themes. The professor directed the computer to advance another billion years, bringing them to approximately 2 billion years ago. Now watch closely, he instructed. Something remarkable is about to happen on screen. They observed as one type of cell engulfed another, but instead of digesting it, somehow incorporated it into itself. What you're witnessing, the professor explained, is endosymbiosis, one of the most important evolutionary events in Earth's history. A larger cell just engulfed a smaller bacterium, but instead of eating it, they formed a symbiotic relationship. That smaller bacterium will eventually evolve into mitochondria, a powerhouse of the cell, as Earth biology students are contractually obligated to say at least once in their lives. So complex cells are actually amalgamations of simpler cells, asked a student from the back. Precisely, eukaryotic cells, the type that make up all animals, plants, fungi, and protists on Earth, are essentially colonial organisms. They alliances of once independent life forms, now working together as a single entity. It's like if all of you in this classroom suddenly fused together and decided to call yourselves a new species. Several students recoiled at the thought, while the hive-minded among them nodded in understanding. Computer, take us to the late Proterozoic era, approximately 600 million years ago, the professor directed. The planet on screen had transformed again. Continents had shifted, oceans covered much of the surface, and the atmosphere had changed significantly. Now we're approaching the end of the Precambrian, the professor explained. Earth has undergone multiple ice ages, including several snowball Earth events, where the planet was almost entirely covered in ice, but life persisted, and it's about to get even more interesting. The view zoomed in on ancient oceans, revealing strange, soft-bodied creatures unlike anything the students had seen before. This is the Ediacaran biota, the professor said, the first complex multicellular organisms on Earth. They're not quite animals as we recognize them. Today they're more like experimental prototypes, evolution trying out different body plans to see what works. Most of these creatures will leave no direct descent. Their evolutionary dead ends beautiful. Fascinating dead ends. The students observed these alien-looking organisms with newfound interest. There were frond-like creatures anchored to the sea floor, disc-shaped organisms that resembled modern jellyfish but weren't, and segmented worms. Unlike any modern species, the Ediacarans lived in a world without predators. The professor continued. They didn't have hard parts, teeth, or claws. Many just absorbed nutrients from the water or through symbiotic relationships with bacteria. It was, relatively speaking, a peaceful time on Earth. So what happened to them? Asked Creel 7, who had developed an odd attachment to these strange, peaceful creatures. The professor's stalks drooped slightly. The same thing that happens to most pioneers. They get replaced by something better. Adapted computer advances to the very end of the Precambrian, about 541 million years ago. The scene shifted one final time. For this era, the organisms on screen were noticeably different, more dynamic, more varied, and crucially, some had shells, teeth, and other hard parts. Welcome to the Cambrian explosion, the professor announced. This is where Earth life as we know it really takes off in the span of just 25 million years, a blink of an eye. In geological terms, almost all major animal phyla appear in the fossil record. It's like evolution suddenly decided to stop procrastinating and handed in all its assignments at once. The students watched in fascination as primitive trilobites, worms, mollusks, and other creatures scuttled across the ancient sea floor. Some were actively hunting others. The age of predation had begun. But what caused this sudden explosion of diversity? Asked Rex, genuinely curious. Now that the professor said with a smile, is still debated among Earth scientists. It might have been increasing oxygen levels reaching a critical threshold. It might have been the evolution of predation driving an evolutionary arms race. It might have been the development of hawk genes that control body plans, or it might have been a combination of all these factors and more. The professor paused, allowing the students to take in the busy underwater scene. The important thing to understand is that everything you're seeing, every creature, every adaptation, every evolutionary innovation, is built on what came before. The seemingly boring bacteria and single-celled organisms of the early Precambrian made all this possible. They transformed the planet's atmosphere, pioneered the basic biochemical processes of life, and eventually, through endosymbiosis and multicellularity, gave rise to the complex life forms that would eventually include dinosaurs, mammals, and yet, yes, humans. The students were silent, many of them seeing Earth's early history in a completely new light. So the professor said, his stalk spread wide in a gesture that his species used to indicate satisfaction. Who still thinks the Precambrian was just rocks and bacteria? Not a single appendage was raised. Back in the classroom after their temporal excursion, the students found themselves unexpectedly energized. What had begun as a punishment had transformed into something far more profound, a genuine appreciation for the immense, slow-burning drama of Earth's early history. Before we continue, Professor Xion said, arranging his tentacles into what passed for a thoughtful pose among his species, I want each of you to share one thing that surprised you about prey. Dinosaur Earth Coral 7's wing extensions vibrated with excitement. The sheer violence of it all. The planet, it was literally formed through cosmic collisions, then froze solid multiple times, then got poisoned by its own life forms. And somehow that was all necessary. Excellent observation. The professor nodded. Earth's history is indeed a testament to the principle that catastrophe often precedes creation. Anyone else? One of the Glicks puddles raised of pseudopod. What fascinated me was realizing that complex cells, the building blocks of all advanced life on Earth, are essentially colonial organisms, creatures working together so closely they became a single entity. It's like an evolutionary lesson in cooperation. Very insightful, the professor agreed. The boundary between individual and collective is often more fluid than we imagine. VX, the silicon-based student who had been the most dismissive, initially spoke up. I was struck by the time scales involved. 2 billion years of single-cell life before anything complex evolved. By comparison, Humans have only existed for about 300 years, not even a rounding error, in Earth's history. The professor's eye stalks quivered with approval. Yes, Earth life spent 85% of its history as single-celled organisms, dinosaurs, despite dominating the planet for 165 million years, are relative newcomers in the grand scheme of things, and humans, they've barely had time to introduce themselves to the geological record. A Cron War student who experienced time differently from most species raised an appendage. What I found most compelling was the concept of the oxygen catastrophe, one species' poison becoming another's necessity. It makes me wonder what we might consider catastrophic today that future life might depend upon. A profound question indeed, the professor said. Throughout Earth's history, this pattern repeats itself. The asteroid that ended the dinosaurs' reign cleared the way for mammals to diversify. The ice ages that nearly wiped out early humans forced adaptations that ultimately helped their species thrive. The classroom had transformed. Students who had earlier been bored and dismissive were now engaged in actual intellectual debate. The professor observed this with satisfaction. This was why he had chosen to teach. After all, now, he said, bringing the discussion to a momentary pause, let in talk about something that Earth scientists themselves often overlooked. Until relatively recently, the microbial world's continued importance. Even after complex life evolved, the holographic projector in the center of the room activated, displaying images of modern Earth microorganisms. Even in the age of humans, microbes remained the true rulers of Earth, the professor explained. They outnumbered all other life forms by orders of magnitude. The human body contained more bacterial cells than human cells. Microbes lived in the deepest ocean trenches, in boiling hot springs, in clouds, and solid rock miles beneath the surface. The images shifted to show various extreme environments teeming with microbial life. These descendants of Earth's earliest life forms never stopped evolving, never stopped adapting. They could swap genes directly through a process called horizontal gene transfer, something complex organisms couldn't do. They could enter dormant states that allowed them to survive for thousands or even millions of years. Some could repair their DNA after radiation exposure that would kill any other life form. The professor paused, letting this sink in. In many ways, the story of Earth is not about the rise of complex life at all. It's about the continued dominance of microbes who simply allowed larger life forms to exist alongside them. A student toward the back raised a tendril. Professor, this perspective seems to contradict the traditional narrative of evolution as a march toward greater complexity and intelligence. Exactly, the professor exclaimed, his exoskeleton vibrating with enthusiasm. That's precisely the anthropocentric bias that dominated Earth science for centuries. Humans viewed evolution as a ladder leading inevitably to them, when it's actually more like a fractal bush expanding in all directions simultaneously. He gestured to the holographic display, which now showed a timeline of Earth's history, with branches representing different evolutionary lineages. Intelligence, as humans defined it, evolved multiple times independently on Earth, in seapods like octopuses, in birds like corvids, in mammals like primates and cations. But so did other remarkable adaptations. Flight evolved at least 4 southeast separate times. Photosynthesis multiple times. The professor swept his appendages through the hologram, highlighting various evolutionary innovations. Each of these adaptations represented a different solution to the central problem of survival, not better or worse, just different. The bacteria that could survive in radioactive waste were no less advanced than the humans who created that waste. They were simply adapted to different conditions. A morphine student who had been quietly absorbing everything finally spoke up. If humans hadn't evolved on Earth, the planet wouldn't be missing anything. Life would have just taken different forms. Precisely, the professor could barely contain his excitement at the student insight. Earth was never trying to produce humans or any specific organism. Evolution has no foresight, no plan, no destination. It's simply the result of variation, inheritance, and differential reproduction. In response to environmental pressures, the classroom fell silent as the students contemplated this perspective shift. And this, the professor continued more softly, is why The Precambrian matters because during those billions of years when Earth seemed to be doing nothing interesting, with just microbes and strange, soft-bodied creatures, the planet was actually establishing the fundamental patterns and processes that would shape all subsequent life. He dimmed the hologram slightly, creating a more intimate atmosphere. The early Earth was a vast evolutionary laboratory experimenting with the very basics of what life could be, how cells should function, how energy could be harvested, how information could be stored and passed on. These weren't trivial questions. They were the most profound questions life has ever faced. And the answers discovered during the Precambrian still underpin all life on Earth today. The professor looked around the room, making eye contact, or the equivalent sensory connection with each student. When you dismiss the Precambrian as boring, you're dismissing the most creative period in Earth's history, the time when the rules of the game were being written. Everything that came later, dinosaurs, mammals, humans, was just playing within the parameters established during those first few billion years. As the class session concluded, Professor Zxylorn expanded the discussion beyond Earth, displaying a holographic comparison of evolutionary timelines across multiple planets. Earth's evolutionary pace was neither unusually fast nor slow, he explained, manipulating the display. Morphia Prime developed multicellular life within just 500 million years, while silicon-based organisms required nearly 7 billion years to advance beyond single cells. Rex's crystalline structure shimmered with pride. Their species evolved slowly, but their million-year lifespans compensated nicely. What makes Earth remarkable, the professor continued, isn't its developmental timeline, but its resilience through catastrophe. 5 major extinctions before humans appeared, with possibly a 6th caused by humans themselves. That seems excessive. Creo 7 commented. Perhaps, the professor acknowledged, but these catastrophes created evolutionary opportunities. The Precambrian extinction eliminated 96% of marine species, yet cleared niches eventually filled by dinosaurs. Earth life didn't just recover after disasters, it reinvented itself. Is that resilience unique? A Glixpool inquired. Earth falls mid-range on the resilience spectrum, the professor explained. Their next 3 extremophiles survive conditions that would vaporize Earth organisms, while harmonious, delicate ecosystems collapsed after minor atmospheric shifts. The professor highlighted a scatter plot of planetary characteristics. Earth's distinguishing feature was its balance between stability and change, the sweet spot of evolutionary pressure, stable enough for complexity to develop, yet dynamic enough to drive adaptation. Too little pressure breeds stagnation, too much allows mere survival with no energy for innovation. A Cronal student asked about Earth's future. Would microbes reclaim dominance after humans? Microbes will almost certainly outlast humans, the professor